with that, I know our presenter has a lot of material to cover tonight. And so we've got Bill Fogarty, who's a member of the Unitarian Church, who's been going through all their archives, and there's a lot of archives, and in a very organized state, he tells me, that he's been going through. And he's going to explore the context of all these events in the 1950s, leading to the desegregation of the schools. And he will be taking questions. So if you're on Zoom, you can put them in the chat. If you're in the audience, we'll be taking questions at the end, and I'll be repeating the questions asked here so that you can hear them in Zoom world. But with that, Bill, why don't you come up and we'll learn about this.
Thank you so very much, David. And I must say, the Arlington Historical Society has so much to offer. That new website is great. There's collections on it. There's so much you can find. But even just go on the old website and catch all the articles dating back to the 50s. There's an amazing amount of stuff you can find. So here we are in September 2024. It's the 61st anniversary this month of the first desegregation of an elementary school in Arlington. And we'll get to that shortly. It has to do with some of the work I did checking through the archives of the Arlington Church. Unitarian Church was founded in 1948. And the first building was just looking up at the slide there on the right-hand side was just a hall. And then as Arlington grew, baby boomers came through. There were a lot of children for Sunday school. So they built this wing. So by the end of the 50s,
Bill, this is Marty. You need to be sharing the presentations because Zoom is not seeing the presentation.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Can I get some technical help for sharing?
Dave, you need to give him a hand.
Whoops.
Are you not seeing that, Marty?
No, I hit stop sharing at one point earlier before we got started, right?
There's the website.
All right, you can probably see us all now, right?
Well, you're not sharing in Zoom.
Yeah, no, I'm going to the share screen. Let's see, where did the presentation go?
Hit entire screen, and then we'll click PowerPoint.
Yeah,
Three tabs. Go to the tab on the right that says entire screen. Mouse up. On the white part. Choose tab.
Okay, entire screen. Right. But like what I don't see.
Hit share at the bottom on the white screen. There you go.
That's grayed out.
Hit the icon of this entire screen. Just mouse over that. There you go. Hit the blue button, share.
There you go.
Now hit the PowerPoint. On the bottom.
Everybody else can see this.
There's a little P icon on the bottom.
All right, we're getting some competent people up here.
There you go. You almost there.
There you go. Now just set it into slideshow. Okay. There you go. You're good.
So now everybody at home can see the church in the 1950s.
We see it. We see it well. Yes.
Okay, we're good, Marty?
Yep, you're good.
All right. That's the hall on the right. That's the religious education on the left. By the end of the 1950s, the church had over 700 members and 700 children in their school. This was the baby boomer age, right? 75% of the members were federal employees. So I'll give you an idea of the makeup of the church. So I jumped into the archives. I found so much. These yellow newspapers. This was there was an article in 1964 about the 15th year anniversary of the church hosting an interracial camp every summer. They had done it every summer since 1949. The Women's Day Alliance did it, and it was a remarkable effort. So I found more and more, and I found this, and I brought some, for those who are here, some poster boards of church history. So I found this at the Unitarian Church of Arlington, 1959. The youth group was known as the Liberal Religious Youth. Weren't afraid of the word liberal. In 1959, the Arlington schools to integrate, and Parents Magazine gave the youth group a national award for paving the way for integration. And we'll take a look at that as we go along. And that's a picture of Mildred Eldridge and her son, Bobby Eldridge. We're members of the church. And it says there in the yellow highlight, one of the first black students slated for transfer to a white junior high school in 1957. And it's highlighted in part because I just want to point out that we have to be careful when we're studying history. He actually was the first one into a white elementary school, not junior high. It's an amazing story I'll share with you today. So I kind of started with the first desegregation of the schools in Arlington, a Stratford Junior High, and it was called The Day Nothing Happened. And here are the four students: Gloria Thompson, Lance Newman, Ronald Deskins, and Michael Jones. But some things happened. Not that nothing happened. There was no violence. There was a bomb threat, but they ignored the bomb threat because they had surveillance on the school for about a week before it opened. So that led me to write an article for the Arlington Historical Society, 1958 Arlington, the year that something happened. And that's a photo from August 1958 of Dorothy Ham and her husband, Leslie Ham, and the son, Leslie Ham Jr., going to what's called pupil placement interviews in August of 1958. Now, I come to this, I like to share some of these slides here on history. History is not what happened, it's the story someone tells us about what happened. So it's my viewpoint, things I found. And I like this, the historian Barbara Tuckman, she used index cards, and she had a workshop full of index cards, and she brought students into her workshop, and she said, history depends on which cards I pick out and in what order I pick them. And I was reading recently, Ron Chernow writing Hamilton apparently he does the index cards. He had 30,000 index cards to choose from. And it is a long book. So what was I finding? I was finding all kinds of articles in the archives that were saved. And here was one headline from the Washington Evening Star: Negro woman arrested at mixed race picnic. Refused to leave a racially mixed church picnic at Arlington County's white Bonnier Park. This is a story of Mildred Eldridge. So I want to set the scene. All right, Sunday, June 1st, 1958, Bonnier Park, right off of Wilson Boulevard. And we're going to see there's a Unitarian church picnic held every summer. Mildred Eldridge is at the picnic. She's married to Robert Eldridge, who could not attend that day because he was a DC police detective. He was actually the first DC black motorcycle policeman. She was there with her two children, Bobby and the younger sister, Sheila, and a few other black members of the church, and then including a lot of church members. Smokey Stover, some people may know that name. He became chief of police decades after this. He was a motorcycle policeman this day. Somebody flagged him down, him and his partner, and said there are black people on the white park, Bonnier Park. And as Peggy Fisher, a member of our church, recounted in an oral interview, suddenly the people at the picnic heard these motorcycles come, and the police officer were going round and round the parking lot. And they came in and they told the black members they had to leave the park. It's a whites only park. The other members leave. Mildred Eldridge says, no, I will not leave. She asks her friends to take Bobby and Sheila home, and she is arrested. Now, the minister, Reverend Ross Weston, tries to talk them out of it. He goes down with Mildred to the courthouse. She's fingerprinted and photographed, and she's charged. What is she charged with? The magistrate in the courthouse doesn't know what to charge her with, and he calls Bill Hassan, the Commonwealth attorney, and says, what do I charge her with? The first charge that the police officer said was for conduct tending to incite a riot. Hassan says, no, charge her with disorderly conduct. It sounds like Rosa Parks, right? Another thing that happened in October 1958, there was a bomb threat at the church. And here are tons of photos from it. It just so happened a reporter from the Northern Virginia Sun was at the service that day. And it's amazing to find out in the 50s how much the newspapers covered religious news. So this was like they were there right during the bomb threat. I want to talk about Reverend Ross Weston. He was the church minister from 1950 to 59. He had this phrase for stand for democracy. In 1952, May 5th, 1952 was the death of democracy in Arlington County for a while. 3 county board members were thrown off the county board by Judge Walter McCarthy on a legal technicality. He criticized the judge, and for that, he got fined for contempt of court. He testified in Richmond in 1954 on Brown versus Board of Education, the only time that there was a public hearing on it. He criticized book banning in 1955. There's so many things he was involved in. And I think we kind of see some echoes in history here, don't we? So he forms in 1951, and here's one of my typos. It was the Community Council for Social Progress with E.B. Henderson and others. Now, who is E.B. Henderson? He's the grandfather of black basketball. He came from the City of Falls Church. He opened the first NAACP branch in Virginia in 1915 and helped Arlington start one in 1949. And he was very committed to racial justice for a number of decades. I want to introduce you to Jack Rathbone. Who was Jack Rathbone? He was an Arlington resident, happened to live on Roberts Lane, where I live, which is just kind of strange. He was part of the Defenders of State Sovereignty and Individual Liberties. If it sounds like the White Citizens Council, that's what it was. And there were different branches in different counties, and he headed the branch in Arlington County. And if you put in his name on a newspaper search, you'll come up with a lot of stuff. Here was an interview with Arlington's Jack Rathbone, which I found. Now, Weston, again, his sermons were publicized. It must have been 2 or 3 times a year, different sermons. And he had a sermon denouncing what was the anti-NAACP laws. The Virginia General Assembly passed a number of laws to harass the NAACP in the mid-1950s because of lawsuits being brought. And Rathbone was annoyed by this, and he put together what's referred to as a circular. Basically, that's a handout you would hand out at the shopping center or something. And in this, I just want to quote here, he said, "It is now open season on squirrels. There's no bag limit on the 2-legged variety this season. The use of the horsewhip is still legal and most effective." He's asked about the circular, and he says, "You've heard of tar and feathers, haven't you? Well, that's one way to get rid of a scoundrel." And when he was asked if it was a threat, he said, "It's in English. Read it and decide for yourself." So this is who Weston and all of Arlington is dealing with when it comes to integration. Now, I want to give some context here because I want to go beyond just the education part. Lance Newman was one of the students who desegregated Stratford, and there was an interview with him. I want to shout out the Charlie Clark Center for Local History in the library. There's just a ton of interviews with folks from the 50s and 60s. Lance Newman was interviewed for this in 2016. And I want to talk about just segregation in general. He's going to Parkington. Parkington is where the Ballston Mall is now, was a big shopping center in the 50s. And this is from the interview. He says, "The sign just said, 'In the bathroom.' I can vaguely remember it saying colored. That was one of my first introductions to segregation." This is a picture of Tops Drive-In here. And he says, "There's a restaurant called Tops at the time on George Mason Drive and Lee Highway, and they were saying you could only go in the back if you wanted something for takeout." That was one of our memories of the segregation in Arlington. So I want to talk about segregation in the schools, but just segregation in the community. And I need to give you some legal history. I'm a retired lawyer, so I like to look at the law. Virginia spent centuries trying to define race. Back in 1785, every person who shall have 1/4 part or more Negro blood shall be deemed a mulatto. Every 20 or 30 years, they're redefining it. In 1910, they redefined Negroes as people with 1/16 or more Negro blood. And then they realized, well, why don't we just flip it and we're just going to define white. And the Racial Integrity Act was passed in 1924, which prohibited interracial marriage, and that's Loving versus Virginia eventually. Defined white as a person who has no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian. And there were requirements that on voting rolls and other public records to identify who was colored. So this is the context as we get into the 50s. And I want to talk about race and education connected with race and public assemblages, like the public assemblage we're having here tonight. Number 1, education and race. 1902 Virginia Constitution. White and colored children shall not be taught in the same school. So that's what they're relying on when it comes to Brown versus Board of Education. And if you want to give them credit for at least saying colored children will be educated, there was the 1869 Constitution when Virginia had to be readmitted into the Union. And as a requirement, they had to say that they would educate Black children. So that's just a little context here. Here's Kemper School, one of the first Black schools. 1875 to 1944 is a picture of Kemper School, the rear of it in 1942. Who was Kemper? 1875, he was the governor of Virginia at the time. All the governors from 1869 to 1900 were former Confederate officers. Legal history number 2, the Public Assemblage Act. This is a photo of Hampton University, the scene of a dance concert in 1920s when a newspaper publisher and his wife went to a dance concert and they had to sit next to a Black couple. And she was so offended that they made a big stink of it. The newspaper publisher pushed through with his influences this Public Assemblage Act. And this is in the 1920s, right? What was going on in the 1920s? A lot of Ku Klux Klan activity. So here's the law. Any person or institution which provides for any place of public entertainment or a public assemblage must designate separate seating for white and colored persons. So I want to talk, what is a public assemblage? So you see here, here's a sign from state law requires all colored passengers to ride in the rear of a bus. There actually was no law on that. And the case here, I referred to Lottie Taylor versus Commonwealth of Virginia. 1946, is a bus a public assemblage? What was Lottie Taylor charged with? She gets on the bus in Washington, D.C. She's in, I think, the 5th or 6th row. There's some white people behind her. They cross the river into Virginia, into Arlington and Lee Highway. The bus driver says, you got to move to the back of the bus. Lottie Taylor says, I'm not moving. Bus driver gets back in the bus, drives right down Lee Highway to Fairfax County Courthouse and gets her arrested. Right? What is she charged with? Disorderly conduct. Right? There was no law. It's not a public assemblage. The bus driver testified, well, she said in a very loud voice at one point, I will not move. That is just about all there was to it, except she absolutely and blankly refused to move or leave the bus. The court ruled it was not disorderly conduct and she was freed. Libraries. Are libraries public assemblages? So this is a photo of the Alexandria Library sit-in 1939. Samuel Tucker, an attorney, planned, have 5 of his friends go in one at a time, each sit at a different table, take out a book and start reading. And they got arrested. And they were not charged with public assemblage violation. They were not actually charged with disorderly conduct because they were very smart in having one person go to one table at a time. And the case just stayed there. It was never dismissed until about 5 years ago. Alexandria finally decided they would dismiss the case. But it's not a public assemblage. So now my question is a gathering at a park a public assemblage? All right, make you guys the magistrates. What do you think? There's Bonaire Memorial Rose Garden. And so a question I ask myself is, how did Bonaire Park become whites only? Okay. Was it law or was it custom? And that's a loaded question because it was not law. There was no, Mildred Eldridge was not violating any law. So that's why she was charged with disorderly conduct. It was custom. And so I throw a rhetorical question out to you. Who's to blame for this segregation? Why did this segregation occur? Something to think about. Another question for you. Is a candidates forum sponsored by the League of Women Voters a public assemblage? Yes, they think it is. And there's the article from 1956. Arlington librarian fined for violating racial laws. Her name was Faith Bissell. She's a white woman, a librarian working in DC, but living in Arlington. November 1956, Thomas Jefferson Middle School, candidate forum. Faith Bissell gets up from the white section, sits in the what's called the Negro section, and is arrested. She says she will not move, much like Lottie Taylor. I will not move, or Mildred Eldridge, and guilty of violating Part 2 of the Act, failure to take space assigned. Person who fails to take the assigned seat is guilty of a misdemeanor. Now, here's the picture of her, and unfortunately, it was not the best picture, I think, of Faith Bissell, but there were a lot of articles on her and what was going on in the case. She was brought up before Judge Hosmer in his lawsuit. Who's representing her? Edmund Campbell. You may know Edmund Campbell if you Campbell Avenue in Arlington. He was an attorney, and he had been on the county board years before. And he is excited about this. I was reading his interview from the 1980s, because he's going to make constitutional law. He's going to go to the Virginia Supreme Court and get this public assembly law overturned. And so, well, maybe they won't overturn it, but I'm going to the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm going to make some history. Well, at the trial, at the appeals court, I mean, one of the justices opens up by saying, "Well, let me see the warrant for arrest." And Campbell's like, "What's going on?" And he gets the warrant, and the justice says, "Well, wait a second. It doesn't say Faith Bissell was a white person, so I'm going to throw this out on a technicality. There's no violation because we can't prove what the color was." Now, completely getting around the law in order to throw out the case on a technicality. So what happens next year at a candidates forum, 1957? These are some articles I saw in the archives. 7 arrested on mixed seating count. Continuance is given 7 in Arlington seating case. So this is October 28th, 1957 at Swanson Junior High. Marjorie Taylor from Halls Hill gets up from the Negro section, sits next to Ruth Tryon in the white section. Ruth is from the Unitarian Church, who'd been board chair. She had gone down to Richmond to testify herself, and very involved in the Community Council for Social Progress. So Marjorie Taylor is arrested. And I knew she had been arrested. I had seen articles, but 7 people arrested. And it says there were 5 arresting officers, but only 1 charged. So what was going on? Well, here are the 7 people who were arrested. And, these newspaper articles, they give you their addresses all the time, so we know exactly where you live. So there are 2 white women, Grace Osher and Abby Hadley. Marjorie Taylor at Emerson Street. 3 ministers, Reverend John Winters, Columbus Wilson, and Thomas Robinson, and Galvester Crawley, who's identified in the article as a Negro barber. So 7 people arrested. There were 5 arresting officers. 6 of them did not go to trial. Why not? Because they were arrested before the meeting started. And so I can imagine, and I would love to know if any of these people are around or their relatives, is that a minister sat in the front row of the white section, got arrested, and then somebody else sat in the front row, and another police officer came and arrested them. So you have 5 arresting officers. And I can only imagine, did Marjorie Taylor come late and sit in the white section, or did she just watch everybody else get arrested and then decide 10 minutes in to make her move? In any event, 7 arrested, only 1 charged. So here we are at the end of 1957. We have 2 legal issues. We have the Public Assemblage Act, Marjorie Taylor awaiting trial, and we have segregated schools, right? Brown versus Board of Education, there's been no desegregation yet. And then this is a case I hope everybody would know, the Clarissa Thompson and others versus Arlington School Board is a lawsuit which at the end of 1957 is on appeal to the 4th Circuit. Now I want to talk about the school lawsuits and run you through what happened. January 1956, the Virginia General Assembly meets. One thing I didn't know was back in those days, they only met every 2 years. They met in 1954, before Brown versus Board of Education was decided, and now they're meeting in 1956. And it's their opportunity to respond to Brown versus Board of Education. They've been considering what's called the Gray Commission and a number of proposals that they're going to do. Nobody in the General Assembly is happy. Then in February 1956, while they're still cogitating on laws, the Southern Manifesto was issued by 19 U.S. senators and 82 congressmen. One of the congressmen is Representative Joe Broyhill, who's the Arlington representative, and the 2 Virginia senators, including good old Harry Byrd. And Harry Byrd calls for massive resistance, uses that phrase. And the General Assembly decides, well, you know what? All those proposals, we're only going to pass 1 law. And that is to allow for tuition grants for white students to go to private schools. Now, the NAACP is thinking, what happened to all deliberate speed? They're not acting. So then they file multiple school lawsuits in May of 1956. in Front Royal at Warren County, Norfolk, Charlottesville, and Arlington. The Clarissa Thompson lawsuit. And the county immediately is ordered to integrate. And that picture you see on the right-hand side is from the Washington Afro-American newspaper. And I'll just give you a quick, on the far right side is Ethel Thompson, the mother of Clarissa Thompson. And next to her is Barbara Marks. She was a member of the NAACP and was a remarkable white ally. And she actually was one of the plaintiffs. Her son was one of the plaintiffs. They had white and black students in the lawsuit. There were actually, the Orndorff family also was part of that. They had so many harassing phone calls, they got out of the lawsuit and they moved out of the county for a year. But Barbara Marks stayed in. In the middle is Esther Cooper. She started the NAACP in Arlington in 1941. Behind her, you can't really see, is E.B. Henderson, who at that time was the president of the Virginia NAACP. And then there's another woman and her son who are plaintiffs, Margaret Finner. The county appeals, they lose on the appeal. So now we're in 1957 still. Okay, September 14th, there's an order to admit 7 black children in 4 white schools in September of 57. Not Clarissa Thompson. Why not? Because she has graduated from Hoffman Boston High School by this time due to the delay. So here are the 7 students. Robert Eldridge III, he could go to Patrick Henry or Fillmore. They lived right off of Fillmore Street and First Street, South First Street, not far from TJ. So he could have gone to either school. Leslie Ham and George Nelson, they picked their junior high because they're equidistant to Stratford and Swanson, the Costley brothers, Swanson, and the Johnson girls to Washington Lee High School. So this is the order. Meanwhile, the General Assembly comes back in a special session, passes all these anti-NAACP laws. It's introduced by the Arlington delegate, Harrison Mann. So you would like to think Arlington was not involved, but Harrison Mann was right there. This was pure intimidation of attorneys and parents. So much so that 2 days after the lawsuit, the order came through, the parents are served with subpoenas to appear before the Committee on Law Reform and Racial Activities to answer questions about their work with the NAACP and what's the NAACP doing with them. When the order was passed on September 14th, there was a great article on the 15th where Robert Eldridge, Mr. Eldridge, says that he's asked, well, what are you going to do about Bobby now? He says, well, September 23rd, Bobby's going to Patrick Henry Elementary School. But the county, before that could happen, appealed the order. No desegregation occurs, more delay. Now, I want to give a shout out to a couple of books by his sisters, Wilma Jones, My Hallsville Family, and Lydia Jones Cole, her sister, You Must Be a Jones. Great stories in there, highly recommended. And in it, I was reading it recently, and she mentions Wilma Jones in her book, her mother, Mrs. Ida Bell Green Jones, she was served with a subpoena on September 16th. And I kind of highlight that, and this is my, I put my notes in here. Think of the disruption of the lives of the parents. I mean, they have to go take a day off work, go somewhere, whether this committee, I think, was meeting in Alexandria, but sometimes they had to go down to Richmond. You're under oath, not represented by an attorney, being asked questions by an attorney. So the intimidation, I just want to kind of point that out. We read sometimes, oh, they were served the subpoena, but what does it really mean? So now we get to 1958, the year something happened. The new governor is J. Lindsay Almond Jr., who had been the attorney general. In his inauguration speech, he talks about against these massive attacks, we must marshal a massive resistance. That's Almond on the far right. Up top is Joe Broyhill, and down below there is Harry Byrd. Now, the Virginia General Assembly is meeting. I have the number 140 there. I just do that to remind myself what I want to talk about. 140 is the fact that there are 140 people in the General Assembly, 100 delegates, 40 senators. Of the 140 in 1958, there are 139 white men, including Senator Charles Fenwick and delegates Harrison Mann, William Winston, who goes on to be a judge, and Catherine Stone, the one woman in the General Assembly. I want to give a shout out to Catherine Stone. She was one of only, I think, 4 people who voted against every massive resistance law that was brought. And she was persecuted for it. I mean, on the floor of the General Assembly. So her story, I think, is a remarkable story. Let's talk about the Arlington government. What was it like in 1958? So there's the county board, 5 members. You'll see next to their names, ABC, AIM, ABC. Okay, what happened that day? Democracy died on May 5th, 1952. That kind of blew up the Democrat and Republican parties. And what happened was they started what had been liberal Democrats, I would say, started the Arlingtonians for a Better County. And the conservative Democrats and Republicans joined for the Arlington Independent Movement. In the mid-50s, it was kind of going back and forth, 3-2. Here now it's 3-2 ABC. I want to talk about Lucas Blevins for a second of AIM. I say he was elected in 1957. He was actually elected in 1956, but started in 57. And it was his candidates forum that Faith Bissell was arrested at. And I finally found an article, what happened after she got arrested. There was Curtis Tuthill was running for the ABC, and a man came up, C.A. Metzler of 3419 North Randolph Street, came up and said to Tuthill, "Tell me directly, are you a pro-integrationist?" And Tuthill gives an answer about supporting the Constitution and is probably waffling. Nobody wants to say they're pro-integrationist. No white person, it seems like. So it was very interesting. Metzler is upset. He gets up to the stage. He pounds his fist on the stage, and there's brouhaha. People come up. You know, it's a heated confrontation. And then when he gets sent out, here are the words in the newspaper from Lucas Blevins. "Today, I'm going to be a stinker. Tuthill has many top NAACP supporters. Does Dr. Tuthill disavow these agitators?" And then he says 2 things, the second of which boggles my mind. But 1, I promise not to appoint a pro-integrationist to the school board. The county board appointed school board members at that time. We had a little period where we elected, but that got taken away by the General Assembly. Then he says, I will not appoint a Negro to a county office. Now, why he felt he needed to say that, I'm not even sure. Well, you could appoint somebody to, I guess, maybe hire somebody. But he comes right out and says that, and he wins the election by 119 votes. Commonwealth Attorney is Bill Hassan. The Arlington Police Chief is William Farver. Just point out it was all white personnel in the police force in the 50s. They did not desegregate until they hired somebody in 1967. And the circuit court judges are Walter McCarthy, from 1932 judge, Bird Machine Man, and Emery Hosmer. School board, what's on the school board? Bob Peck. If you bought I bought a Chevy Nova from Bob Peck Chevrolet. Helen Lane, Lee Bean, James Stockard, and Barnard Joy. Barnard Joy was the last elected member. The others were appointed. School board attorneys, you hear the names of Frank Ball Sr. and James Simmons. What are the black schools then? The elementary schools are Langston and Halls Hill and Kemper and Drew in South Arlington. And Hoffman Boston was the junior high school. The white schools, I just named a few that got named in the 1920s. Maury, Page, Jackson Lee, Washington Lee. You know, these are all Confederate names. Thomas Page was a writer of The Lost Cause. And again, all of this happened in the 1920s. And I also throw in some other names of schools. They're still around, right? Abington, Ashlawn, Gunston, Kenmore, Woodlawn, Wakefield. They were all plantations. It's interesting to think about it. All right, we're in 1958, Marjorie Taylor trial. And Judge Walter McCarthy hears the case. Otto Tucker is the attorney. Now, why do I have the same picture of the Alexandria sit-in? Second person from the left is Otto Tucker, the younger brother of Sam Tucker. And he became an attorney. And I think if anybody here is listening is from Alexandria, we need to do something for Otto Tucker. He represented so many people in Alexandria, Arlington, Loudoun County, Fairfax County, got harassed by the Virginia State Bar. He was amazing. But he brings in an ACLU lawyer, David Carliner, who takes on the Byrd organization and subpoenas so many officials, including Senator Byrd and Representative Broyhill, Judge Reed, who was on the General Assembly in 1926 when the law was passed, and causes a big kerfuffle. McCarthy does something that's surprising. He called the Public Assemblage Act unconstitutional. Hosmer said it was constitutional. Here's the picture of Marjorie Taylor there again. Not great pictures in the newspaper. Seating law held invalid. Ruling's effect is a puzzle. Arlington is a split verdict county. One person says constitutional, one says unconstitutional. The county does not appeal. So the law is unresolved. And the conspiratorial part of me says, did McCarthy actually call it unconstitutional on purpose so that it would stay frozen in Arlington and the Virginia Supreme Court would not rule on it? Any event, it's uncertain, but Bill Hassan, the Commonwealth attorney, says, if there are going to be black people in the parks, we are going to prosecute. So it's very clear what they're doing. So we're now in February. The Fourth Circuit rejects the appeal of the school board, and the case is continuing. Oh, no, wait a second. The county school board files an appeal with the U.S. Supreme Court. Delays ahead. February 1958, massive resistance. They have new laws. Number one, individual schools will be closed if integrated. So not the whole school jurisdiction, just individual schools. Tuition aid for private schools and pupil placement assignments and interviews where you will be interviewed to see if you really can make it in the school you're applying to. It included psychological evaluations and other tests. And of course, it was just the black children who were being subjected to this. I found this in the Unitarian Church. Wade Latham was a board chair, and he's writing a memory. He said, I remember every member dinner of that year with the police outside at Kenmore School with a warrant for the arrest of Reverend Ross Weston, Bob Eldridge, and myself, because Bob was with us in a public school. The police were outside. They never came in, and I suspect that's why they didn't serve him with a warrant, because the police did not actually see the integrated meeting there. April 1958, the Community Council for Social Progress says, let's get that seating law deemed unconstitutional. So they bring a lawsuit against the school board because they want to hold a meeting in the schools, and they're told they can't have an integrated meeting in the schools. Who's their attorney? Oh, it's David Carliner. He's back at it. There's a delay of over 3 years. They completely stonewall it. So eventually in 1962, the school board gives in. May 1958, the U.S. Supreme Court has rejected the Arlington School Board appeal. And I had this article here. General Allman is blaming the Negroes. Arlington County schools might be closed if the Negroes insist on attending the white schools. He said the decision of what will be done will depend on the action of Negro officials pressing for integration. So it's blaming others for closing the schools. Senator Charles Fenwick has his voluntary segregation plea. What he says is the simplest way to guarantee keeping public schools open in Arlington is to convince the Negroes to stay away. So that's his plan, just stay away. And he's writing letters for this. There's more and more pressure on the black community for what they're doing. Are they going to be the ones that are going to close our schools? Now, I found some bad history. The Encyclopedia of Virginia is a great site, Library of Virginia. But they talk about Fenwick, about him opposing the statewide program, massive resistance, and he was not opposing things. So here is James Kilpatrick. Some of you may remember him from Point Counterpoint with Shana Alexander on 60 Minutes. Well, in the 50s, he was the publisher and editor of the Richmond News Leader, along with the Times-Dispatch in Richmond, the big newspapers in the state of Virginia. And he is staunch segregationist, and he puts out an editorial, a full-page editorial, where he goes through, and in addition to the editorial, he goes through the schools that might be closed, how many students are in each class, how many rooms are in each class, and he's identifying, what might happen. And he says, and this is what is in the editorial: if Negroes insist upon an action that will close Fillmore, he's talking about Arlington, that will close Fillmore. Now, Fillmore is now Long Branch, by the way, Fillmore School. Then whites may counter with an action that would close Kemper. In other words, pawn for pawn, night for night, have a white student apply to Kemper, and then we'll close that school too, because only schools that are integrated will be closed. Now, Bobby Eldridge was the only black child applying to Fillmore. So this was, I think of the pressure on the Eldridge family. The defenders of state sovereignty, our friends, they are distributing the editorial in handouts in Arlington. So, this is being seen by others. What's the white Arlington response? The Arlington Committee to Preserve Public Schools. And they come out and they say, we are here concerned neither with perpetuating segregation nor with hastening integration. In other words, we're not going to take a position on it. We just want to preserve public schools. And they have a paid advertisement in the paper, huge advertisement, an invitation to join the organizing committee to preserve public schools. Now, they urge all Arlington citizens who agree with our objectives to join with us now. What they don't say, and this is the unspoken word in a lot of this, is we urge all white Arlington citizens to join us. They would not accept Black members of this committee. And there's there's a list in there of people who are already signed up. Now, the Committee to Preserve Public Schools, the library has some great stuff on their DAP's website. Call it Tale of Two Virginias. And again, I kind of push back about this. It's heartening to note the role of the white racial moderates in the county. And I don't know how heartening it is and where their heart was. But the list is a lot of great people. Vita Henley was the president of the League of Women Voters. She was, a remarkable person. William Lightsey was the head of the Northern Virginia PTA. He ended up becoming the head of the whole statewide preserving public schools. As a little note, his daughter's here in the audience today. And then other names you'll see, Ed Holland will end up becoming a politician. Mrs. Roger Marshall. Back in those days, a lot of times the women weren't given their first name. That's Mary Marshall, who was elected to the House of Delegates for about 10 terms in Virginia. So it's a lot of remarkable names here. Now, I read recently a book called Making of Massive Resistance by this fellow, Robin Gates. It was written in 1959. It was contemporaneous history, which is really remarkable. It makes me think about we need to do our own contemporaneous history. He said there were 4 Virginias. He broke it out. There was defiant segregationists, no integration. He called cushioning segregationists. We'll let a few in. 3, the public school savers, like the Arlington Committee to Preserve Schools. And 4 is the integrationists. Now, I want to push back about this. I'm thinking of different theses maybe. I'd say maybe there are 3 Virginias, but it's a spectrum, right? From white segregationists to integrationist. So in my spectrum here, the white segregationists there on the left, the white moderates in the middle, and the integrationist. And how far that yellow line goes, I'm not sure. So the white segregationists, yes, on the far ends, Jack Rathbone, Kilpatrick, Vinsley Almond, Harry Byrd. The white moderates, maybe I'm being too harsh here, but I'm just tossing this out. It kind of is like they're saying segregation is okay. We have it in our parks, in the libraries, in our hospital, our drugstores, our movie theaters, but just don't close our schools. And then you have the integrationist. Segregation is not okay. So that's one thing I'm thinking of here. Now, even though with the integrationists, they still occupy a spectrum, right, of how you implement integration. But that's anyway. That's one of my thoughts there. And so here's again, massive resistance is what we're talking about. But I'm trying to bring in resistance not just to education, but so here's a phrase I'm thinking of. It's really massive white, because we got to call out the name. Massive resistance is massive white resistance. Massive white insistence, insisting on segregation or going along with segregation. Again, I'm just working up to my next presentation here. So June 1958, the Eldridge family is under pressure, arrested at a mixed race picnic. Ross Weston, the day before the trial, comes out with a sermon, The Myth of Equality. And again, it's reported in the Northern Virginia Sun because they're reporting sermons. He says, we will not be intimidated. We will not surrender to harassment. We will not be frightened. We will continue to help cleanse the immorality of our state. Again, that was in the newspaper article. I want to write out beforehand, Harrison Mann, the delegate, he had to come out in the paper saying segregation, massive resistance, this is not a moral issue. It's a factual issue. And that really ticked off Ross Weston. He had another sermon that got reported on in the newspaper, actually had an op-ed saying, yes, it is a moral issue. And I put a little note here for the Martin Luther King quote from the letter from Birmingham jail, which he talks about white ministers. And he says they talk about follow the law because it's a law, but why not support integration because it's the right thing to do? The sermon, again, which was in the archives, Weston ends with this. The person I feel most sorry for in this entire episode is little Bobby Eldridge. When his mother came home Sunday night from the police station, he said to her, "Mommy, why don't they leave us alone?" You think of his 9-year-old kid and all is going on. His mother's been arrested. He was there when the police came. Weston says, that is a very good question. I'm not sure many of us have the real answer to it. So the next day is the Mildred Eldridge trial, June 9th, 1958. The courtroom was packed with Unitarian members, basically. Mr. Eldridge was there. I was reading a little memoir he had written, and he talks about being followed after the proceeding on his way back to D.C. Now, maybe that a little paranoia, but I think somebody who was a motorcycle policeman knows when he's being followed. So that was a interesting tidbit. Everybody should write a memoir, right? There's a lot of good history out there. So she's not guilty, freed by the court after her arrest at Mick's picnic. Of course, freed by the court. She wasn't actually in jail. But at the trial, Smokey Stover's on the stand, the motorcycle policeman, and he's asked, was her conduct disorderly? And I guess he kind of hems and haws and said, well, she just didn't leave. So much like Lottie Taylor, the bus in 1946, unlike Rosa Parks in 1956, charged with disorderly conduct and let go, not guilty. So here we are. All this is going on. The school stuff is still going on, right? In June, you have more students applying. So it's not just the original Clarissa Thompson plaintiffs. 13 Negro students now seek entry is one day in June. First Negro entry bid at Gunston Middle School. Negro applies for entrance at Wakefield High School. So more and more applications are coming in. This is something I hadn't heard about. June 22nd, 1958, there's a cross burning at Callaway United Methodist Church in Halls Hill, a black church. And there's an article in the paper, Fiery Cross Burned at Negro Church. And there had been other cross burnings. Dr. Harold Johnson, eminent doctor in the black community, had a cross burn on his yard, and there had been others. So this is going on. Again, this is like the pressure, I would say, on the black community. Dorothy Ham's a 1986 interview with her, and she talks about the phone calls. It makes me think of Scott King talks about this a lot in her time in Montgomery. It's like calls at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the night, terrible. And she talks about burning crosses and even more. I mean, it's a very interesting interview. And she says, at one time, I thought it was the law that was against us, but I found out that it was the hearts of many people also. There are many people with very black hearts. It was just sad to read that. She went through so much. There was a great presentation by Kathy Hicks. It's on the YouTube channel for Arlington Historical Society on Dorothy Ham and Elizabeth Campbell. So take a look at that. You'll find out a lot more. July, okay. Defenders of state sovereignty, what are they doing? They're recruiting whites to apply to black schools to do what Kilpatrick said, shut down the black schools. He says he's got 30 parents ready to go with 90 children that are going to apply to black schools. So again, this is in the newspaper. They're all reading this, right? Here's the only photo I could find of Jack Rathbone. He's second from the left with glasses reading something. And this is in front of the school that he was creating, a private school for white students with tuition grants to be called George Mason Model School at 2043 Wilson Boulevard. And the people you see in the front there coming out is actually Arlington County inspectors, because you have to have an inspection and have certain requirements if you're going to have a school. So they're leaving here. Now, this school never opened. And this is a kind of a famous sign of the open, come in and register George Mason Grammar School, and grammar's misspelled ER. Never opened, but again, this is what's going on. Virginia is panicking. So now they're studying a plan. Maybe we'll close only integrated rooms within the school. How you do that, I don't know. So there are federal lawsuits in Norfolk, Charlottesville, Warren County. They're moving through the system, moving quicker than they are in Arlington. And in August, the NAACP changes strategy. This is Frank Reeves, one of the many heroes of attorneys, working so hard for racial justice. The state is insisting all students have to comply with the revised pupil placement laws. Now, the NAACP was saying they're unconstitutional. I mean, it's crazy to require this of Black students. But if they're going to test the constitutionality of that part, then that would have to be heard. Go to appeal, and 2 years later you win on it. Then you go back to where you were and getting the students, getting them in. So they decide, well, we're giving in on that. We're making a concession, and we're agreeing to the pupil placement interviews in August. This is a photo, unidentified man and his son, followed by two reporters. As they were going for these interviews at the Arlington Trust Bank, which is now the Black Heritage Museum on Columbia Pike.
What?
They're being harassed there. The families was interesting. They were meeting at the Eldridge house at Fillmore and actually First Street South beforehand. And so they were able to talk to each other, kind of say, here's some questions you can anticipate. So they're going in for these interviews. No attorneys are allowed. So you just go in yourself. And again, the impact on the families, the parents taking a day off from work, being questioned, without your attorney present. So on August 18th, there's a number of interviews. Mr. Hilton is the interviewer. And he asked, is this application, so far as you are concerned, for transfer being made solely to enforce the so-called constitutional right? Well, Mr. Costley is ready for this. There you are saying so-called constitutional rights. I do not understand the meaning of so-called constitutional rights. What so-called constitutional right? Do you mean because we are colored, we do not have any constitutional right? So at least they were prepped for some of these things. But there are some photos in newspapers of the students, of photos being taken of them, and trying to shield your son and your daughter. Very difficult time. All right, we're still in August 25th. The interviews are done. The State Pupil Placement Board and the Arlington School Board reject all 31 applications. All 31, no, there's all these factors: geography, adaptability, intelligence, mental maturity. Nobody qualifies. So a court hearing is scheduled for the first week of September because Judge Bryan's on vacation. He took a week off. And they had to delay the opening of the schools in September of '58. And he issues his order. He says the pupil placement plan was not discriminatory in and of itself. So it's kind of constitutional, but he orders that 4 students be admitted to Stratford, the 4 we had seen going to Stratford. There's a detailed discussion of most of the students identified by number and letter. It's a remarkable document, remarkably troubling, and the way the students are talked about. And of course, pupil A is, the letters are for elementary school students. There's only one pupil A, is Bobby Eldridge. You can figure that out. And as the judge gives the reasons for not allowing so-and-so, number 22 and number 12, pupil A passes everything except adaptability. And the judge says he would be the only Black student going to Patrick Henry, and that's too hard on him. So we're not going to let him in. Now, of course, Bobby Eldridge had been going to the overly white Unitarian church Sunday school every Sunday, with white students. But, Brian was making that distinction. He delays the admission of the 4 until February 2nd, 1959, because the semester has already started, as if that is really critical. But there's no delay in the other jurisdictions. In Norfolk, Charlottesville, and Warren County, the federal courts ordered integration, and Governor Allman closes those white schools, the white schools. So in Norfolk, the Black schools are still open. And, the front pages are just so wonderful to read in the 1950s. It seems like there's always at least one article about communists in the red. So you see, Ike warns Khrushchev on something in here, but everything else is civil rights, right? FOB is in Little Rock in Arkansas, and in Virginia, Warren County, Arlington Showdown. And then there's a phrase there, a government of laws. That was a statement by President Eisenhower saying, we are a government of laws, basically saying, as with Little Rock, we have to obey the law. And again, makes me think of the Martin Luther King quote, but what's the right thing to do also? So anyway, front pages are fascinating. So what happens in October? This is a fuzzy one. Negro youth gets church scholarship, October 1958. So the Unitarian Church pays for Bobby Eldridge to attend Burgundy Farm as Country Day School, as another typo, in Fairfax County. Burgundy Farm Country Day School is a private school, started in the late 40s, very progressive. It was the first, apparently, I don't believe everything on Wikipedia, first private school to be integrated in elementary school in Virginia. And I put the word leadership there because I just want to remind myself in reading through the Unitarian notes on their minutes on board meetings, there are people who objected, like, this is not right. Why are we just paying a scholarship just for Bobby Eldridge? There's so many needy people. I mean, you can imagine the discussion that goes on in any community, right? Any congregation. But the board chair, Sharon East, was very strong, says, this is the right thing to do. And they ended up, creating a scholarship fund. It was $500 to attend. And it was said this was to be able to prove for next year that Bobby could be adaptable. He could adapt to an all-white situation. So, then we get the bomb threat. Rabbi Frank from the Alexandria Synagogue is coming to talk. He has also been very anti-Bird in his pronouncements. And he comes to talk, and I love this story. The first article there about the church telephone rang, and Mrs. Ann Bowen, School of Religion secretary, answered, and the man's voice said, "Get the kids out of there. We're going to blow up the church." Then the line went dead. Now, as I think I said, it just so happened there was a reporter from the Northern Virginia Sun in the hall that day, and she says, I was taking a look at my watch and wondering why the service was a little slow starting yesterday. She then talks about how the rabbi and Ross Weston came out, but they were not wearing their ministerial robes. And Ross Weston said, your children have been evacuated. We've had a bomb threat. Don't worry, they're evacuated. Now we're going to leave one section at a time. And he goes, left section, you go out now. Right section, you go out now. You in the middle. And it says he grinned when he said this. You have to wait till they leave. So they all go out very carefully. And there's no bomb is found, but it's a big brouhaha because there was a church bombing in Atlanta a few months before. There was a bombing of the church. So what about the aftermath? Okay, that bomb threat happened. Rabbi Frank is coming again the next week then. And the Layman's League, they walk around the building, from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on Sunday, make sure nobody's putting a bomb in the church. And Alan Mayer, again, this is an interview I found by the 5th grade religious education class at Unitarian Church in 1998, interviewed Alan Mayer as part of some project. He went on to become a member of the House of Delegates in Fairfax County. He was a young usher at the time. In order to kind of completely give you the story here, the Unitarian Church, in the back of the church, there's a membership book, and anybody was entitled, you could sign the membership book. Okay. So as this, he says he's in the back of the church, it's full, Rabbi Frank is talking, and a well-dressed man comes in and stands in the back. And he identifies himself. He is George Lincoln Rockwell of the American Nazi Party, which was very prevalent in Arlington that day. He shows up at the Unitarian Church. He tells Alan, I just came to let you know I did not call in the bomb threat. My men did not call in the bomb threat. He then goes to tell Alan Mayer, my parents are Unitarian. And when the administrator heard that, he grabbed the membership book and had never been in the back of the hall since. But Lincoln Rockwell, he signs it. Early on, I guess he was calling himself just Lincoln Rockwell. Mayer walks out with him. On the steps there are Rockwell's men in their brown shirts and swastikas. And what they ended up doing is putting brochures on the windshield cars. It was called Who's a Hate Monger? And amazingly, in the 1958 minutes book, two-hole punched is an original of the pamphlet of Who's a Hate Monger. It was like a 6-page pamphlet. And it's just it's a remarkable document in a very difficult time. But who did call on the bomb threat? We'll never know. November 1958, the NAACP attorneys are being harassed again. The plaintiffs are questioned. They have to go down to Richmond. Dr. Harold Johnson and others, Barbara Marks, have to go down to Richmond. And then there are November elections, and Joe Broyhill wins. But in the debate with Joe Broyhill, there was a question presented: how do you believe the school integration program should be handled? And he couldn't show up, so he gave a written answer. He proposed a long-term solution of 3 types of classes: white, colored, voluntarily integrated. Again, it's like impossible. It's didn't even make sense, right? December 1958, Broyhill meets with the parents of the 4 black students who are to enroll at Stratford in February. He asked them to delay entry until the next school year. So more pressure. This congressman is in your living room asking/telling you that it's really a good idea to wait until the next school year. You can read more about it in My Household Family by Wilma Jones. So this is December, right? February 2nd is the date we're looking at. Legal arguments are completed. Norfolk's federal case is called James versus Almond. Who's the attorney for the parents in Norfolk is Edmund Campbell. They couldn't get any attorneys in Norfolk to represent them, so they had to come up to Arlington to get Edmund Campbell to represent them. And then the state has their own test case. They were testing their own constitution, so they brought their own lawsuit against the Attorney General. January 1959, 2 rulings are issued by the state court and the federal court on January 19th. It's a state holiday, January 19th. I'll ask, what historical personage was being celebrated on January 19th? Lee and Jackson, right? Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. I took a look at the statute before I got repealed. The statute for those 2 men mentions the holiday and refers to them as defenders of causes. Just defenders of causes. Interesting way to put it. In any event, the judges come out and the state loses. They strike down the massive resistance law. They say, Norfolk, you're to open schools, and you open on February 2nd, just like Arlington. The state test case, the state loses, but they went down swinging. The opinion written by the judge, he was so mad at Earl Warren and U.S. Supreme Court for putting them in this situation. But anyway, it was unconstitutional what they were trying to do, the General Assembly. January 24th is the 4th Circuit hearing of the Arlington County appeal. The Arlington attorney, Frank Ball, his argument is quoted: "Love is essential in schools," tells the court. White teachers would not be able to love those colored youngsters. Anyway, January, the 4th Circuit denies the Arlington appeal. The county files for a stay with the U.S. Supreme Court. Delay. Saturday, January 31st, they get the Supreme Court out of bed, and they ruling on a request for a stay is by Earl Warren himself. 2-sentence ruling. Basically said, there's no basis for a stay. School opens on February 2nd. Now, what was happening in January, again, things you find in the archives are these articles. A Get Acquainted buffet dinner at the Unitarian Church, sponsored by its youth group and the Community Council for Social Progress, had 27 of the 30 black applicants and 50+ white students at this buffet. And I note that the article was written by Tom DiBaggio, a Washington Lee student. So if anybody knows Tom DiBaggio, if he's still around, I'd love to talk to him. It talks about him talking with Charles Augins, one of the black applicants, realizing they were taking like the same courses at Washington Lee. So it was a great situation. All right, Lance Newman, his interview in 2016, he goes to say, what was the influence? Well, he says the black churches and black community leaders. Mount Salvation Baptist Church, Callaway United Methodist Church, they're both shown in the photos there. Community leaders, Mrs. Ham, Ms. Costley, Ms. Deskins, and all the others. A lot of preparation on how to act, how to dress, what might happen when you go to school. The abuse you may have to suffer, the name calling and the stares and all of that. So these students are going through all this. And I like this. He talked about being tutored at the Unitarian Church by Mrs. Weston. That's Ross Weston's wife. And Lance says, the thought at the time was that we weren't maybe academically up to the level of the white kids that were at Stratford. They had tutoring sessions. They were going to tutor us in math and English and stuff. So they started with math, and I was really good in math. Ronnie and Michael and Gloria, they were pretty good in English and stuff too. So they started and they realized that, I didn't realize this at the time, but what happened was after about an hour, they said, these guys are just as sharp as anybody else. And so we were tutored for maybe an hour, and then we went out and played basketball with their sons. But there's interesting support. So here we are, February 1959, the day nothing happened. Well, I think a lot happened, a lot of pressure on everybody. The picture on the right is from Norfolk, the one black student who is physically isolated from the white students. Norfolk had 6 schools open, 17 students. Arlington School Board, then in summer of 1959, in a repeat of the summer of 1958, they reject all the remaining black student applications in the summer of 1959. Now, I meant to put in here like a meme of a forehead slap, right? It's like, what are you doing? Judge Bryan orders the entry of 13 more black students, including into Washington Lee High School, junior high schools, and Bobby Eldridge. Though the school board persisted into the 1960s, that's for another presentation of how they continued segregation. But I want to talk about Bobby Eldridge. Here, his first day of school in September of 1959. You see the newsreel cameraman, right? Taking a newsreel of him. People are taking pictures. He's in that looking spiffy in the his blazer there. When they woke up that morning, the first day of school, they were getting ready for Bobby, and they noticed a police car outside. And the police car, they said, we're here to take you to school. So for the first month, sometimes the police car took them, sometimes they walked. But that's at Patrick Henry Elementary School 65 years ago, almost to the day. The Eldridge family on the left in 1986, Bobby and his mom, Mildred, are in the middle of the picture there. They came back to Patrick Henry and talked to the students. And Arlington Magazine had a great article on Bobby Eldridge in 2012. You can find it online. Sadly, Bobby Eldridge died this past February. He was a musician, a very accomplished musician. So I want to kind of end here on Mr. Eldridge's playground. Again, what life was like for the black population. He wrote a memoir of a UUCA African American. We're now Unitarian Universalists, so you see 2 U's in there. In 1993, he said, my next problem, my children were not allowed to play on the playground near my house. Now, again, why not? It's not law, right? It's custom. There was a vacant lot across the street from my house I wanted to buy to make into a playground for the kids in the neighborhood. And I was reading this, and again, I'm trying to double check all the history. I took a look at his obituary from 2016, and there, people made comments in the obituaries, and one woman wrote, I still remember how much Mr. Eldridge cared for the neighborhood kids. He made a playground, especially for us, and made sure no other kids messed it up. So that playground was built. So we'll give him the next to last word. Here's a picture of Mr. Eldridge later in life at church. But in 1993, he said, today you can see the playground in the 2700 block of South First Street. It's not there anymore, by the way. It exists because a church member who knew nothing about me except I was a member of the church took the necessary action. He had been an usher, Mr. Eldridge, and was talking to Al Copeland, another usher, saying, I can't get a bank to loan me any money for this. And Al Copeland said, I'll loan you the money. And that's how, one thing led to another. Last word, Clarissa Thompson. What happened to Clarissa Thompson? The original lawsuit. She's now Clarissa Thompson Sly, and she is an artist. She went to Hampton University as she graduated from Hoffman, Boston, majored in math. She worked for NASA after that. And then she got her MBA at University of Pennsylvania. And then she became an artist, and she's an artist now to this day. So here's Clarissa Thompson Sly with one of her artworks. She's in the National Gallery of Art collection, Museum of Modern Art, National Women of the Arts. It'd be great if we can get her in the Arlington Museum of Contemporary Art. Here is a photo exhibit she put together, and the phrase is, historical amnesia blocks the construction of successful social movements. As the gap between the past, present, and future diminishes, individuals can acquire a greater sense of becoming the makers of their own history. Thus, for the oppressed, the act of reconstructing history is inextricably linked to the political practices of transforming the present and the future. It's a quote she took from Manning Marable. I think I was just so excited I was able to see something online. The internet has some good things. And so that is the end of my presentation. And I guess we'll go to questions, take some questions. 8:12, so that was about 65 minutes. That's what I thought I would do. So yeah, 90 slides, we went through 90 slides. So any questions from the audience? Yes.
Two questions. One, what was the role from other faith communities and denominations in Arlington? And it talks about the rabbi as well as the Unitarian Church. And two, what about the role of the Virginia Supreme Court in striking down massive resistance?
Okay, so the question was, I'm trained to repeat the question, the role of other faith communities at this time and the role of the Virginia Supreme Court. So other faith communities, first of all, I would say it would be great for every institution, faith communities and private institutions, to kind of research the history of what was going on then. I will say Rock Spring Congregational Church had done a lot at that time. Our Lady Queen of Peace, a Catholic community in South Arlington. They actually, his father, Michael Kanda, started the CYO basketball in 1950, and it was integrated, and the black churches for sure. And it's interesting because I think it was in 58, the Ministers' Council came out with a announcement and a statement on behalf of integration. It was all white churches. So you still had associations, so to speak, were segregated. You know, there was not the black teachers were not part of the Educational Association. They had their own. The Arlington County Bar was white only, and so there was a black bar, national bar. There wasn't much. The Unitarian Church did talk with some of the South Arlington churches to create that interracial workshop, so. There was some, and I think there's a lot more to, as we've talked about the phrase reconstructing history or just reviving history, see what's going on. So that's what I know a little bit about faith communities. The Virginia Supreme Court was kicking and dragging into the desegregation world, where I say they try to find technicalities to avoid it. And the Public Assemblage Act kind of got tossed out in the early 60s by a judge who just was really upset that he has a rule for desegregation. So the Supreme Court was not helpful, but they were keeping things out of the court, so to speak. Okay. Yes?
The process sounds protracted and unpleasant. Was there any violence? Was anybody hurt? No.
So the question is, it's protracted and unpleasant. Was there any violence in it? I would say in Arlington, no, and in general in Virginia, no. I mean, there were there are not a lot of lynchings in Virginia. Last ones are generally in the early 1900s, So no, I think the answer, there's no overt violence. And Dorothy Ham, one of her interviews, talks about her son being pushed off a counter at a drugstore. I don't know if there was little elements of violence. I'm not sure people would want to advertise that too, Yes?
I graduated segregated Yorktown in 1964, and I'm curious, when did all Arlington schools integrate?
So the question was, the question went to Yorktown. It was still segregated in 64. When did they fully integrate? 1971. 1971 was when the lawsuit said, and the judge says, we hereby declare Brownsman completely. And that's when they came up with a busing plan. Again, that's another thing. 1971, they came up with this complicated busing plan so that students in Green Valley were sent to multiple different schools, right? And not just a school, Abington nearby, but even all the way out to Jamestown, far away. And it's just done mathematically. And there's a chart on this. No more than 15% Black students in the school was kind of their threshold as they started to bus students out. But that's when they said, we've complied with Brown completely. So.
Bill, you might want to ask Marty.
Yes, Marty, we have any in the chat?
There's no questions, but there are a couple great comments that are worth repeating. It says, thank you, Bill. Great history, and we need to be reminded. Janice says, great presentation, bringing together all of the various people and moments that defined Arlington civil rights at the time. Thank you, Bill. This is Amy says, great presentation. Horrifying to realize what things were like, but we have to know it. You did some wonderful research. Kudos. And Linda says, for your information, although Reeb Hall, the original UUCA building, was torn down, there is a plaque on the edge of the parking lot about its history in Arlington civil rights. And then there's other thank yous, Bill.
Okay. Thank you. But thank you, Marty. Thank you, Arlington Historical Society. That brick building was taken down eventually, and there's the new sanctuary that was built in 1964 on that site there. And I'm trying to remember, did I say that, the church was at 444 Arlington Boulevard? It had been called Lee Boulevard at that time. We had Lee Boulevard and Lee Highway at the same time. So slowly but surely, that name is starting to go away. So lots of great stories. Thanks for coming. I taught an encore class in the spring and teaching one in the fall. There's just too much going on to learn. The Arlington Historical Society is a great resource, and that website is excellent. So no further ado, we'll all go home.